Warship was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. Additional funding is provided by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Center Sierra 82 has gone active. Classification Area 82, surface hostile warship.
Attention in the section tracking Party Sierra 82, the contact of interest has been classified as a hostile surface warship. Chief of the watch, man battle stations.
Man battle station.
Take charge of place. You got that 150 feet.
Man battle station.
Works as main battle station. Attention in the fire control tracking party. Intelligence from sonar indicates that Sierra 82 is making 12 knots. All stations evaluate for a speed of 12 knots. Carry on.
The modern submarine is a weapon of stealth, slipping silently and secretly into enemy waters. Ships like the USS Honolulu can watch, listen, or attack just about any target anywhere in the world before anyone even knows it is there.
Clear, open ejection pump door port side. Open muzzle door tube 2. Clear, right?
The crews are highly trained and are able to stay submerged and perform under high stress for months at a time. And the submarines they command are the marvels of today's navies.
Bearing, mark, 206.1. Now let's go.
They are the pinnacle of modern technology.
140 feet.
Nuclear-powered and able to roam the world's oceans alone and undetected. But their evolution has been a slow one.
Flying point procedures, Master 1, Tube 2.
Stand by.
Stand by.
Stand by. Shoot.
Shoot 2-2.
Unit is running. Wire is good.
What began as a primitive tool of the underdog has evolved into the ultimate weapon of war. The dream of a submarine first became a reality in 1776, when a clam-shaped vessel named the Turtle carried out the first attack ever recorded by a submersible. The mission took place during the Revolutionary War, a desperate effort by colonist David Bushnell to humble the British Navy. At the Boat Museum in Essex, Connecticut, a working replica of the Turtle has been constructed and tested by two enthusiasts, Joe Leary and Fred Fressé.
Joe had a 4-page description that David Bushnell wrote to Thomas Jefferson on what the submarine was and how it was constructed. And from that 4-page description, we went and built the boat.
The basic principle of a submarine is that you want to take your vessel and have it weigh exactly as much as the same sized and shaped parcel of water would weigh. Now, in order to make the submarine work, your boat has to be able to be both lighter and heavier than that amount of water. And the way that we do that is by having a great deal of lead in the boat. Because obviously, you look at this is a wooden submarine, and wood is buoyant. It encloses a big bubble of air, and air is buoyant. And it encloses me, and I am buoyant. So naturally, what you've got to do is have something that'll push all that'll make it less buoyant and make it submerge. This is the exact same principles that you have in a modern Trident submarine and a modern Seawolf class submarine. Nothing has changed whatsoever.
The modern Turtle builders faced the same crucial question as David Bushnell. How much time could they spend submerged?
On one of our dives, I took it out to the center of this pool we were using. I dropped it down to the bottom, and I just sat there. And we had no problem being down for an hour. You can have shorter dives, though, where you're spinning the propeller and working the pumps, where you'll exhaust the air in a lot less time than that. And that leads to a couple of problems. And the first one is your atmosphere is closed. The hatch is secure. You're not going to get any more air from anywhere else. So you have the twin problems of using up all of the oxygen, but also of carbon dioxide buildup. You know, in modern submarines, they have lithium hydroxide canisters. They absorb the CO2 in any number of ways. Here, there's just no option.
In 1776, Army Sergeant Ezra Lee was chosen to carry out the attack. His target was the British flagship moored in New York Harbor. It was one man and a hand-powered barrel against the world's most powerful navy. But all Lee had to do was quietly place an explosive device beneath the hull of the enemy ship.
What he probably did was submerge himself beneath the boat, pump the water out of the ballast tank, and drive the spike into the bottom of the ship, and then flood himself down again and break away the shaft, release the mine, and get away from it.
Ezra Lee did get underneath the boat. He did manage to get the screw smacked up against the bottom of the boat, but unfortunately struck one of the iron braces that is associated with the pintle and the rudder assembly and bounced off. Well, what Lee found was he came up alongside the boat. Suddenly he went from hunter to hunted and spent the rest of that night trying to get away. Well, the fact of the matter is, no one knows what boat he attacked that night. We've been all over the Public Records Office of the Admiralty, and no one has any indication that there was a submarine attack at that time. Now, when you think about it, this is one of the most remarkable, dramatic things that ever happened in the history of naval combat. And there's no one like the British in terms of, you know, monopolizing the great advantages in naval combat. And yet I have this image that they're standing there on their decks, almost like the dinosaurs, looking down in condescension at the little mammals that are taking away their eggs. They had no concept that the world was changing fundamentally at that moment in that spot.
But despite the initial attempt by Bushnell's Turtle, it was not until 100 years later, during the U.S. Civil War, that the world next witnessed a submarine attack. In this case, once again, the submarine was the weapon of the underdog. The submersible was the Confederates' CSS Hunley, named after her key financial backer, Horace Hunley. The target, the Union ship USS Housatonic.
The Hunley basically was a machine of desperation. Think of the mid-19th century going out in the middle of the night in a submarine. Even after all these years of research, still the ring of Confederate submarine just isn't supposed to be there. It just doesn't sound right. There's just something wrong about it. Submarines are supposed to be in their infancy in World War I, and here we have one that actually sunk a ship 50 years before then.
On the drawing board, the Hunley was to be powered by batteries. But in 1863, the technology wasn't ready. So the batteries were replaced by 8 men cranking the propeller.
They had serious problems virtually from the beginning. One of the first efforts led to the loss of life of 5 out of the 9-man crew. This was in September 1863. Then in October, a second tragedy occurred when Horace Hunley, for reasons we don't even know, took command of the submarine himself, went out. He had no experience in this sort of thing. He evidently hit the lever that let water into the ballast box. It plunged to the bottom, bow first, stuck in the mud, and the whole crew of 9 died. Surprisingly, General Beauregard agreed to a third trial, and surprisingly, one could still obtain volunteers to go on board.
Our intelligence tells us the Federal fleet is massing in this area off of Rattlesnake Cove. I want you to take the Hunley out and reconnoiter that area.
The attack was planned for February 16, 1864. Lieutenant George E. Dixon's 8-man crew would ram the Union ship Housatonic under cover of darkness. Their weapon, an 18-foot pole with an explosive charge at its tip.
On the 16th of February, I'll take my crew to Hunley, out on Rattlesnake Shoal, and any ship we come in contact with, we will sink.
With the Housatonic only 4 miles out, they knew that they could just go out in about 2 hours and get it. And they went out about 7 o'clock at night, and they reached their destination at about 8:30, from all eyewitness accounts from the sailors on the Housatonic. And they ran the charge in and backed away, and the only thing that seemed to have gone wrong with the attack was that they were only about 60 to 80 feet away from the Housatonic when they wanted to be 150 feet away. And they were spotted as they sort of broke the surface and came close, so they were met with a barrage of small arms fire.
No one knows exactly what happened in the confusion that followed. But just as the explosive went off beneath the Housatonic, tragedy struck on the Hunley as well. One theory is that she surfaced too close to the Housatonic and was swamped by the explosion. Recent attempts to raise the wreck may offer some answers, but more likely the truth was lost with the crew when the Hunley went down.
One of the names given to it here in Charleston was the murdering machine. Now, since it killed 3 crews during testing, was that nickname because it killed crews, or was it the nickname the murdering machine because it went out and murdered Union sailors on their ships?
Either way, the murdering machine had made history, carrying out the world's first successful sinking by an underwater craft. But the Hunley was hardly an ideal design, and even as she came to rest on the ocean floor, others were developing the concept of an unmanned torpedo that might be safer and more practical. The effort began in the early 1860s and was led by Robert Whitehead, an English engineer working for the powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. Whitehead's vision was ahead of its time.
It was Whitehead, who must be one of the most brilliant applied engineers in history, who immediately came to the conclusion that actually if you had a weapon that could fly quite deep and away from the immediate influences of the surface and so on, and you made it totally locomotive, now you have really quite an effective weapon that can be delivered from quite a range.
Whitehead says, well, wait a second. If I can make a little compressed air motor, it doesn't have to be very powerful because I package all this in a little package, and in effect he makes a self-guided submarine, right? Because the thing travels underwater. He calls it an automobile torpedo because it runs itself rather than just being pulled. At first it's a very primitive animal. It makes maybe 9 knots, but it has very interesting potential.
By the late 1860s, the Whitehead torpedoes were functional, but not yet effective. 15 years later, they were being launched off crude platforms from the decks of warships.
The first use of a Whitehead in history occurred in 1877, when the Shah fired a weapon against the Huáscar, which had been pinched by a Peruvian pirate. That first torpedo actually missed, probably because the torpedo was slower than its quarry.
The Whitehead torpedo was problematic because it couldn't keep its depth, it didn't steer straight, and it didn't go very far or very fast. And all 3 of those things had to be settled before it could work effectively. The critical breakthroughs were the gyroscope, which enabled it to keep a steady course, improved depth-keeping systems, basically flotation chambers, and a much improved engine which provided greater power and longer range. And these things come together by 1905, 1910 to create the weapon that in the First World War will transform the battlefield at sea.
But before that could happen, the torpedo needed a more efficient way to be launched. If it could be ejected from a submersible, instead of being dropped from the deck of a surface craft, it could become a devastating instrument of war. Enter the unlikely catalyst, John P. Holland. Holland was a little-known Irishman who immigrated to the United States in 1873. It was here that he would perfect the delivery platform for the torpedo and forge a name for himself as the father of the modern submarine.
John Philip Holland was a rather unlikely submarine designer. He was a Christian brother. The Philip was actually the name he'd taken as a Christian brother. He was a teacher, although not that effective a one, apparently. But he had a passion for technology. He could really, it was found, he could explain technology more than other subjects. And he had a great flair for invention. And as a patriotic Irishman who had emigrated to the United States in the aftermath of the famine, he became associated with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenians as they were called.
The Fenians funded Holland's early work. They wanted a submarine to strike at the British Navy, and one of Holland's early attempts was designated the Fenian Ram.
He actually rather fell out with the Fenians. The money ran out. And quite soon, in fact, Holland was getting as frustrated with them as he was for a while with the United States Navy. But as time went by, he decided that his role was to design a submarine for his adopted country, which of course he did.
When the U.S. Navy held a submarine design competition in 1893, Holland's inventive engineering skills produced the clear winner.
That submarine became the Holland V. It was steam-driven. It was 85 feet long. It was 68 tons. It was a big boat. The reason he used steam was because the specifications the government insisted on were so high in horsepower required and speed that he couldn't get it with any then known internal combustion engine. And steam was the only power that could do it.
This steam plant was not insulated, so when it was fired up and the hatches were closed, the heat inside became totally intolerable. This ship was a disaster. It never did work right.
By 1896, he's looking for backers to build another sub. Also, he's figured out that what he really needs are a combination of storage batteries and electric generator. Storage batteries for underwater power, electric generator to repower them when he's on the surface.
Holland found what he was looking for at the electric boat company run by Isaac Rice. Rice agreed to fund Holland in exchange for the rights to his submarine patents. Out of that arrangement grew the Holland VI, the ship upon which all modern submarines would be based. Once submerged, the Holland VI was powered by batteries that had been charged on the surface with an internal combustion engine. She had a hydrodynamic shape, a fixed center of gravity for stability, and a reserve of positive buoyancy. And she was the first to use multiple trim tanks.
Many of the earlier boats had very large tanks that were either partially full or they had steam boilers. Either case was very, very dangerous. Any down angle or up angle on the boat would cause the water to rush to one end or the other, and the boat would stand on end. Such was the common thinking at the time then, that a submarine had to be level diving in order to be safe. Well, John Holland blew that theory out of the water. By filling his tanks up completely and then using just very small tanks to adjust the trim, his center of gravity was stationary. This allowed him to travel up and down on an angle, porpoising, basically operated a submarine like a fish. Therefore, the Holland dove like a modern submarine does.
One of her first dives was on, of all days, St. Patrick's Day. And it had been raining, and when he came up, there was a rainbow. It was almost too good to be true, like a stage setting, you know. But from then on, the Navy began to take an interest, and it sent its naval board to inspection.
But the board had its doubts.
The Navy had complained that it behaved like a drunken washerwoman when submerged. though Holland argued all along that it was just inexperience on the man at the helm. The original Holland had the rudder's forward propeller, like a modern nuclear boat, but during trials, she did not behave very well, rather sluggish. So John Holland was forced to put all that structure on the stern in order to get the rudders aft of the propeller. Once they had a successful submarine, the Holland Torpedo Boat Company, which had by now become the Electric Boat Company, basically removed the inventor and started to market the submarines to get a return on investment for their stockholders.
Holland was fired, but the tide of technology had turned. Weapon and platform had come together, and the combination was about to prove lethal. Holland's creation had outpaced his vision.
He has written that he felt this was a weapon to end all wars. He felt the submarine would make wars obsolete because nobody could find it, nobody could stop it, and therefore naval battles wouldn't occur.
But governments had other ideas. Britain, the world's superpower at the time, embraced Holland's revolutionary boat, and in 1901, the British Navy commissioned its own Holland I. It was the ultimate irony for the Irish inventor.
In Britain, the key player here was Admiral Sir John Fisher, who specifically left the Admiralty in 1902 and went down to be Commander-in-Chief at Portsmouth so he could oversee the introduction of the first submarine flotillas and actually have a hands-on role in developing the submarine from a local defense vessel into a sea-going and later an ocean-going instrument. It's interesting because the two men that have serious thoughts about how submarines will be used in the next war, Holland and Fisher. Holland doesn't live to see what happens, and Fisher does. Fisher was quite right. He said, this will change the way that we fight, this will transform war, and people will do really diabolical things with them. They will sink unarmed merchant ships on the high seas with them.
In August 1914, Britain went to war with Germany. The stealthy submarines were about to make an explosive debut.
The first and most stunning success for the submarine in the First World War came when the German submarine U-9, commanded by Otto Weddingen, sank 3 large British cruisers off the Dutch coast. They were so surprised by what happened that when the first one was hit and started to go down, the other 2 closed in, stopped, and launched their boats to rescue survivors, and they too in succession were torpedoed and sunk.
This attack was the signal that the weapon of the underdog had finally arrived. It propelled naval warfare into a new era. U-boat commanders realized stealth was a key element to their operations. So they discarded the rules of engagement laid down by the 1856 treaty known as the Declaration of Paris.
In order to capture a ship legitimately, you had to stop it on the open seas, you had to board it, inspect its papers, and you had to allow the crew and the passengers good opportunity to escape from the ship before you sank it. These were the so-called cruiser rules, and they governed how war at sea should be fought. They were, of course, far too civilized for the First World War, which was nasty, brutal, and total.
The important novelty in the way the Germans used their submarines against British and Allied trade in 1915, when they declared a war zone and unrestricted submarine warfare, was that submarines would act in a way that nobody ever thought they would before the war. That is, shooting on sight, not picking up survivors. And this was what the Germans began to do. And the combination of the submarine used in this previously utterly inhumane way, as it was thought, proved an extremely effective instrument indeed. And in a context where Britain was expanding the blockade items which it wasn't allowing into Germany to cover almost everything, including food, the Germans thought they had the right of retaliation.
But the unrestricted warfare tactics of the German Navy ensured a grim roll call of innocent victims. On May 7, 1915, the Cunard liner Lusitania, filled with neutral American passengers, was torpedoed by a U-boat off the coast of Ireland. Over 1,000 lives were lost.
The Lusitania story is an essential part of World War I. It has all the elements of the Titanic disaster, all the romance of the rich and famous going down with the ship. And the Lusitania really stratified anti-German sentiment in Britain and the United States. It's a contributing factor, at least, to the American involvement in World War I.
Submarines were tearing up the rules of war, threatening the British Navy's superiority and its previously unassailable command of the seas. By 1917, a renewed German U-boat campaign had very nearly brought Britain to her knees.
The key to the success of the German submarines in the First World War isn't any technological superiority. Their boats might have been slightly better made, and their diesel engines were probably of a higher quality than the British engines. But the basic German U-boat and the British submarine of the First World War were not very far apart in performance. It's just much easier to be a successful submariner if you're attacking the world's oceanic shipping, which is very numerous, unescorted, whereas British submarines are trying to attack fleeting targets which are moving at high speed and well defended, essentially German warships.
The solution for the Allies was to reintroduce the age-old standby of a convoy, merchant shipping escorted by warships in collective groups.
And this blunted the German submarine offensive, rendered it far less effective, and enabled the Allies to survive at sea while they brought over immense numbers of American troops and basically ground the German army into the dust on the Western Front in 1918.
After the war, the victorious Allies banned U-boat construction. But undeterred, the Germans continued to develop submarines in a clandestine design bureau in the Netherlands. When Adolf Hitler took control in 1933, he approved plans to once again openly build the U-boats. By the end of 1935, 24 were under construction.
The Germans knew exactly what they wanted for their submarines. They were going out to hunt down our merchant ships. For that, they wanted speed on the surface. They knew they would have to go through very rough weather. They knew they were going to be attacked with depth charges. They were going to go in harm's way. They built their submarines from the very start under Admiral Donitz from 1935 on for war and war alone.
Karl Donitz, the German submarine commander, had innovative ideas about U-boat operations. His strategy was a ruthless campaign that made use of radio communications to guide multiple U-boats to their prey.
1935, when he's designated as Commander-in-Chief U-boats, he experimented with radio communications again to develop what is widely referred to as Wolfpack, but to the Germans is known as Rudeltaktik, literally meaning group tactics.
When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it shadowed at a safe distance and called other U-boats into position by radio. Designed for fast surface running, the U-boats raced to their intended victims. When enough were assembled, the pack would pounce under cover of darkness. The early months of World War II were known to the Germans as the happy time because of the largely unopposed Wolfpack successes in the Atlantic. The U-boats' coordinated use of radio was devastating, but the Allies soon countered with audio technology of their own. the twin inventions of radar above the waves and sonar below. Hunting U-boats became a high-tech game of cat and mouse, a game still played by modern navies.
Sonar ready.
On the USS Honolulu, computers help analyze the sound information from the huge array of hydrophones in the bow of the submarine.
Purser 82 is going active, classified hostile surface warship.
Sonar operators are trained to distinguish the noise of propellers from the ambient sound of the oceans. They can identify and classify other submarines and even torpedoes simply by the sound they make in the water. And, in addition to their ability to listen,
Ready in all respects.
today's submarines are also well equipped to attack. During World War II, the advances in the Allied capabilities came just in time. In December 1941, war erupted in the Pacific Rim, creating a global conflict that would prove to be the ultimate challenge for the newly improved submarine technology.
Yes, it was up to the submarines. At that time, we had exactly 51 submarines in the Pacific, and that included 12 of the old S-class. On December 15th, 8 days after Pearl Harbor, American subs drew their first blood.
But before the war was over, much blood would be shed on both sides. And some was self-inflicted when technology failed.
Ready. 1. Pull.
Right from the onset, the U.S. Navy experienced major technical problems with its torpedoes.
Stop. Breech is locked. Tube 1 ready.
You would think that the way to destroy a ship is to make a hole directly in the ship, so you have to hit the ship. Turns out that's not the case. If you explode something under the ship, not that far under it, but underneath, it forms a sphere of gas. The gas rises and literally bounces the ship into the air, breaks it in half. It's devastating with one hit. Well, they try it once. They say, whoa, this gets kept secret. And they were going to use a magnetic exploder to set it off, because you have to have something that the ship will set off at a distance. Wow, it works. They call it the index mechanism.
In the submarine school, before the war started, they said to us, to my class, we're going to give you a special demonstration. This is going to win the war for us. And they had this gadget on the tabletop. The demonstrator had a steel rod, and he passed it over this gadget. And as it passed over, it went click. And he said, you see, this is a torpedo exploder, exploding mechanism. And if it passes under an enemy ship, when it passes under the ship, and this rod represents the ship passing overhead, when it goes click is when it explodes.
Unfortunately, it didn't work very well. It didn't work well because the ship's magnetic field varies with where on the Earth it is.
Then the other problem was there were periodic circular runs. In some cases, the boat spotted them and got away from them. Others, there was 2 submarines lost during the war, both ours, due to circular runs on torpedoes. When they fired them, they just made one big circle, come right back and hit you, and that was it.
We saw this tanker, we pursued it, Japanese tanker, and we finally fired a torpedo, several torpedoes, and one of them ran in a circle. We heard the thing going around, coming right back. So we went for deep depth. We take her down fast.
Dive, dive, dive.
So the ship was angled down, and I was in the conning tower, and it was blacked out because it was at night. And in front of my face, a light bulb was hanging down on a wire, and it had been turned out by unscrewing it slightly in the socket. And as the torpedo came back, it exploded. It was the loudest noise I've ever heard in my life. It could not have been more than 10 or 15 feet away from me. It went off magnetically, prematurely, or I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. And that light bulb flashed into brilliant flame right before my eyes. And then it shattered into a million little pieces, some of which hit me in the face. And I remember clearly my thought at that time. I thought, I've just been killed.
Not until 43 do we have torpedoes that actually work. You can imagine also that when you fire perfect shots and nothing happens except they depth charge you, this tends not to have a great effect on the morale of the officers.
Somebody should have been shot for sending the darn things out here. But the argument was at the time when they designed them and started using them, not during the war, of course, they were too expensive to waste in testing. But how many lives did it cost? And how much really would it have shortened the war if they'd have been right?
Once the torpedo problem was solved, American submarines went into high gear. Over the course of the war, they were responsible for almost 60% of the 8.8 million tons of shipping lost by the Japanese.
It's often argued that the American submarine campaign against Japan was an example of how to do it, and something the Germans could perhaps have learned from. The analogy is false. It's not just that the Japanese didn't escort their convoys until quite late on and didn't do it very well when they did. It's that the Americans had complete air superiority over most of the region they were fighting in, and they were winning the war at sea. They had command of the sea.
And in the Atlantic, the tide was turning their way as well. Since communication was the key to the German Wolfpack strategy, code breaking began to take on a vital role in the Allied attempts to counter the U-boat menace. The British succeeded in decoding the enemy ciphers after capturing a German Enigma machine. And in the fall of 1942, the U.S. broke the German naval code. The code breakers and the new technologies of high-frequency direction finding and radar allowed the convoys to avoid the Wolfpacks and enabled the hunter-killer groups of Allied ships and aircraft to neutralize the U-boat threat. In Britain, the Battle of the Atlantic was coordinated from a secret bunker beneath the streets of Liverpool. The Royal Navy's Max Horton, a veteran World War I submarine commander, led operations to lay bare the U-boat's cloak of secrecy.
Horton is particularly interesting because he's not just the first British submariner, he's almost certainly the greatest. He was the classic poacher turned gamekeeper. He understood the submarine psyche, and he was put to work to destroy the submarine service of Germany in the Second World War. And he did this by attacking their morale in the most fundamental way. He insisted that submariners would be beaten, not by avoiding them, but by killing them. And by the middle of 1943, the morale of the German submarine service had cracked.
The Nazi is forced to the surface. Immediately, a torrent of gunfire is turned on the crippled sub. It is doomed.
By April 1943, Dönitz and the Germans were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. To regain his advantage, Dönitz put its faith in two new secret technologies that allowed U-boats to spend less time on the surface. The first was the snorkel, which allowed the submarine's batteries to be recharged at periscope depth. The second was hydrogen peroxide, or HTP, a revolutionary new source of oxygen for the engines that eliminated the need for surface air. It meant faster U-boats that could spend more time submerged.
By about 43, the Germans are designing a sub that'll run for about 10 hours at 24 knots. Well, you've got to realize that in the past, they're talking about 1 hour for, say, 8 knots. That's a big difference. 24 or 25 knots means that underwater, the submarine can probably outrun most surface ships. And that means that basically the submarine can do what it wants. That's devastating. By 1945, everyone knows this is the future, and the real future is this hydrogen peroxide stuff. It's called Type 26. When they capture Hamburg, Hamburg is where it's supposed to be built. And they actually go to the German yard and they say, we'd like to buy one. That's when they find out, yes, well, we have all these drawings, but it doesn't quite work yet, fellows.
After the war, the British Navy attempted to advance peroxide technology on the HMS Excalibur and the HMS Explorer.
Arriving at London's West India dock is HMS Explorer, one of the Royal Navy's latest. Used as a fast underwater target, she's provided much valuable information for anti-submarine tactics. Her fuel's described as high-test peroxide, which is not to be confused with the stuff used by ex-brunettes.
But the HTP was extremely volatile. The technology was a dead end.
By 48, there's a submarine officers conference, which is held regularly, and they're all complaining. No one helps them, the stuff is terrible, they can't get the materials, no one wants to do it. And then someone else walks in, it's Rickover.
Hyman Rickover was a brilliant engineering officer from the United States Navy. He believed that the future of submarines was nuclear.
This chart shows that 1 pound of uranium is equal to 2,600,000 pounds of coal. Here's the pound of uranium, which in comparison is so small that it's represented by a pinpoint.
Here was a fuel that didn't need any oxygen for combustion, one that freed the vessel from the surface. By generating its own air and by purifying seawater, the submersible could finally become a true submarine.
Rickover did one unbelievably important thing. About 48, 49, he had a series of design studies for maybe the next step in reactors. And it was very easy to imagine pushing this technology slowly onwards, and maybe eventually you would do something with it, but it wasn't that mature technology. You could keep pushing a lot longer. Rickover said, no, it's mature enough. We're going to go now. It was obviously Rickover's perception that nuclear gave a new dimension to submarines, and for that matter, surface ships. And that if he did it right, there would be an unbelievable advantage for the Navy.
The result was a new age in naval technology, launched by the Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine.
This wasn't a hot, sweaty diesel submarine. This was just a luxurious boat that was clean, neat, very comfortable to live on, had an abundance of water. Everybody smelled good, and it was just happiness here.
In 1955, Nautilus made conventional submarines obsolete. She was the first to be designated SSN. The N stood for nuclear.
I reported aboard the Nautilus in March of 1957 and served under Admiral Wilkinson. And later that year, we went up under the ice for the first time. And this mission, when we had left Seattle, was announced as a top secret mission. The cover story was we're heading south and going down to the equator, then going to go back through the Panama Canal back up to home in the Atlantic.
The real mission was to feel their way under the polar ice cap and attempt the first underwater transit from Pacific to Atlantic. This was the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the first to develop new technology would gain a key strategic advantage. The success of the Nautilus was a PR coup for the United States.
When we left Seattle in 1958, one of the announcements that Captain Anderson made was that our job was to out-Sputnik the Russians. After we had surfaced in the Atlantic side, one of the things that everybody realized from a strategic standpoint is that we had been in their backyard.
When they arrived in New York Harbor, the crew was met with a spectacular reception. Nautilus had become a symbol of American know-how. She had navigated the last unexplored corner of the planet.
We didn't really know what the impact was. We had no sense of how important the trip was. We knew everybody would rejoice and everybody was happy for us, but we did not fully understand the strategic impact, the economic impact, if there is one.
The impact of the atomic age was a submarine that could go for months without the need to surface. Her only limitation was the amount of food she could carry for her crew. But the ability to stay submerged and cruise at high speeds created a demand for new hull designs.
How do you learn how to control these things at high speed underwater? And how do you learn how to control them before you actually spend on building a fast one. So the question is, how can you build something fast enough that it will simulate a fast sub like Nautilus, and yet doable without Nautilus power plants? Well, they go to David Taylor Model Basin, and they say, find us the most efficient underwater hull form. We don't care if it's very good for a combat sub. All we want is something real fast. They do a series of experiments in their test tank. They find out that the most efficient hull form is what's called a body of revolution.
The result was the Albacore, now on display at the Maritime Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
By term body of revolution, well, I think you can see it the most graphically if you get out an imaginary knife and slice through this piece of bologna we call albacore hull, like so. In every section that you slice through would be a circle.
Designed to operate a good deal of the time on the surface, is on the way out. Submarines of the future will be true submersibles, designed to operate underwater 99% of the time, and will be shaped like a streamlined whale.
The shape reduced drag, allowing the Albacore to achieve record speeds underwater.
It was remarkable. It could start from dead in the water and beat a maximum speed in a matter of minutes. Now, the advantage there is obvious. If you're trying to escape or trying to attack or even trying to transit, high speed from the get-go was essential.
This is a Navy picket boat. It is traveling at twice the speed of the fastest World War II submarines. The Albacore's speed, like that of the Nautilus, is highly classified. The Navy says only that it exceeds 20 knots.
There he is. Mark, bring me up about a foot. About a foot, aye.
As you watch the Albacore's periscope overtake the picket boat, you may get some idea of the speed of the atomic submarines of the future.
At such high speeds, control was critical. A simple turn could put a submarine into a dive, sending it below crush depth and killing all aboard.
We had a little dorsal rudder behind the sail, which was to overcome the JC, and excuse me if I offend anyone, the Jesus Christ factor, because when we hit a curve at high speed, you went literally into a snap roll. And we took several deep roll dives, as we called them, down to about 54 degrees. Imagine standing at 54 degrees. It's quite a lean. So we learned if we were in a dive and high speed, throw the rudders over and you'll come out.
The Albacore has been a dream of man for more than 400 years because she flies underwater. She is the true submersible. And when the Nautilus nuclear heart goes into the Albacore form, man will never worry about coming to the surface to breathe and to look about.
The joining of the Albacore shape with the nuclear plant of the Nautilus resulted in the skipjack class of submarine. It became the basic blueprint for all submarines that followed.
Other than the fact that you are now in a nuclear submarine that has made a quantum leap toward being a true submarine, limited only by the food supply, the next event that you can look at is the evolving of the weapons systems on that platform.
The new weapon of choice for the submarine was the missile, if a way could be found to launch it. Missiles were first tested in World War II, when German scientists produced the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The Allies quickly realized that missiles would give submarines a crucial new capability to attack land targets.
At the end of the war, we're interested in experimenting with missiles fired by subs. In fact, the Russians are also. By '48, we have contracts out for next generation, and we build a missile called Regulus. Regulus is subsonic. It flies about 600 miles. The problem with Regulus is it takes a fairly large sub to carry very many of them. They're carried in big hangars on top of the sub. And incidentally, if for some reason a wave comes along while you're setting up the missile, you may sink in the process.
There she blows.
But then there's ballistic missiles. They're real interesting because it turns out you can fire them while you're submerged. We also discovered that we can build a solid fuel missile that'll fly a very long distance. And also we can build very small nuclear warheads. If you put all these things together, suddenly you have this little missile that you can carry in some numbers that's quite devastating. And by the way, there's nothing anyone can do about it. Oh, interesting.
In 1960, the SSBN George Washington, the world's first nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, successfully test-launched 2 Polaris missiles. She was now a silent strike platform, capable of launching nuclear warheads more powerful than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined. The Cold War had produced stealth technology with awesome firepower. And today, the SSBNs still patrol the seas in their role as a deterrent. And attack submarines carry powerful Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of deadly accuracy.
What you have now is a very disordered world. So the role of military forces tends to be to react to things all over the place. In that kind of world, submarines still have an interesting role. What a submarine really offers you as a government is it's invisible. It can go somewhere at high speed. It can hang around somewhere without aggravating a situation. If you think about a lot of crises, if you suddenly turn up with, say, a large naval force or a lot of airplanes or something like that, you'll have a real effect on what happens, and it may not be the effect you wanted. The government may very well want badly to be able to decide what it does. Submarines give it the time to make that decision.
Today, 5 nations maintain ballistic missile submarines, and beneath the waves, advances continue to occur. For now, modern submarines lead the way as the ultimate invisible force in the water. But they are not impervious to disaster, as the tragic sinking of the Kursk in August 2000 so clearly illustrated. From its beginnings as a primitive iron boat, the submarine has evolved into the ultimate stealth platform, capable of launching nuclear warheads at targets over 4,000 miles away. With no place on Earth more than 1,400 miles from the sea, the submarine is poised and powerful enough to destroy entire countries. The fast carrier USS Abraham Lincoln steams into the wind. She is a United States Navy Nimitz-class carrier, named after World War II Admiral Chester Nimitz. She is the biggest and most sophisticated war machine ever built. Today's supercarriers are nuclear-powered, carry nearly 100 aircraft, and are operated by 5,000 sailors, aircrew, and Marines. They are the hub of the modern carrier battle group. And together with their complement of Aegis missile cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and attack submarines, they control a 500-mile radius of air, sea, and land. The carrier, even as a concept, is a relatively new advance. It was only thought of in 1910. Since then, technology and tactics have created a vessel that is master of the seas and skies. but it was a day of infamy that precipitated the modern carrier's rise. In 1941, the best naval aviation force in the world was the Imperial Japanese Navy. Early on the morning of December 7th, aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers set out to destroy the American Pacific Fleet. In doing so, they ended forever the reign of the battleship. When the attack was over, the U.S. Navy found itself left with only its carriers, which had been away from Pearl Harbor when the raid took place. A new kind of war at sea had arrived. The story of naval aviation had its unlikely beginnings in the small town of Hammondsport in upstate New York. The man behind the concept of the carrier was a speed cyclist and motorcycle engineer named Glenn Curtis.
Curtis was a motorcycle racer, and so he was always striving for a better engine. Curtis tried to improve the power-to-weight ratio, constantly getting more power for less weight. And that was exactly what you wanted if you were trying to fly back in those days. That got him into the air through the back door because the first dirigibles to fly in this country used Curtis motorcycle engines to power them.
The Wright brothers had proved that heavier-than-air flight was possible on December 17, 1903. But in the first decade of the 20th century, aviation was still very much in its infancy. Glenn Curtis made his first flight on May 21, 1908, his 30th birthday. Buoyed by the success of his first exhibition flight later that same year, Curtis was soon looking for ways to capitalize on his creation.
The U.S. Army had already bought a Wright airplane in 1909, so Curtis set his sights on the Navy and tried to develop ways in which the airplane could be useful to the Navy.
Curtis realized that for an aircraft to be useful to the Navy, a crew would have to be able to launch it at sea. In November of 1910, working with one of his crack pilots, Eugene Ely, Curtis convinced the Navy to rig up a makeshift deck on the cruiser Birmingham, anchored in Norfolk, Virginia.
And the idea was that Ely would fly off of this deck and then back to shore in order to demonstrate that it was possible to fly off a ship. Nobody had ever done this before. They rigged this up, and Ely revved up his Curtis pusher and shot forward across the deck. And when he came off the deck, he fell toward the surface of the sea. Now, the reason for this was he didn't have enough speed to get airspeed. Ely actually did hit the surface and skipped and bounced off it. And it must have been a kind of scary experience for him because he damaged his rudder, he damaged his propeller, he soaked his clothes, and he caked over his goggles with spray. Well, the Navy was very interested in the fact that he could fly off a ship, but pointed out that, of course, that was an incomplete progression.
To convince the Navy of the viability of their idea, Ely joined Curtis on the West Coast, where they rigged up another makeshift deck on the armored cruiser Pennsylvania. Their goal here was to prove a plane could land on a ship.
And this time, Ely took off from Selfridge Field, and he came in for a landing on the makeshift deck on the Pennsylvania. Now, they had a problem doing that, too, because he was going to need more space to stop than the Pennsylvania offered. So they made an ingenious arrangement. They took 22 lines of hemp rope, laid them across the deck, and tied heavy sandbags to each end. And the first time anyone ever landed on a ship, he used a tail hook to catch those cables and bring himself to a stop, just like a jet-powered aircraft does today.
The concept was ahead of its time, but a landing platform covering the gun turrets wasn't practical. The Navy decided it needed a plane that could function alongside the ships. Curtis's solution was a hydroplane that could operate from the water.
While he was trying out this vessel with water testing, suddenly realized he was getting too close to shore, yanked on the wheel in order to turn himself away, and took off unexpectedly. He didn't realize he was going to do it. Ships in harbor, naval ships, saw this and started hooting their whistles because they realized what he had done. Now you've got something worth talking about. Now you've got an airplane that can work along with the ships without requiring us to cover up the guns.
Curtis was a great pioneer for two reasons, I think. Not only because of what's normally understood, that is his development of aircraft. He built aircraft, he designed aircraft, he tested aircraft, but also because he trained some of the Navy's pioneer aviators.
In fact, Curtis set up an entire school to teach people to fly. He had customers from all over the world, including Japan, and he trained key U.S. Navy personnel like Officer John Towers.
He was in charge of the aviation detachment at Guantanamo Bay when they went down for fleet exercises in 1913. Eventually, one of the officers said, well, since we're in the middle of maneuvers, why don't you take off and scout, see if you can find something. So Towers took off, and almost as soon as he got up above Guantanamo Bay, saw the, quote, enemy fleet approaching 15 miles away. So right at the very beginning of the career of submarines, and right at the very beginning of the career of dreadnought-type vessels, all of a sudden this tiny, fragile, inexpensive aeroplane was proving that they would not be able to dominate the seas. Neither one of them would be able to dominate the seas. And Glenn Curtis himself had written in the Saturday Evening Post in 1910, when an airplane costing a few $1,000s can sink a battleship costing $1 million, there will be some change in the composition of navies.
But airplanes were not quite up to the task just yet. The skies were still dominated by self-propelled dirigible balloons called Zeppelins. The Zeppelins could stay airborne for hours, making them ideal for gathering information.
At sea, the point of the Zeppelin is that vision. It's a scout. Scouting matters a great deal. As long as there's no serious air opposition, scouting is very effective.
The British developed their own balloons, but couldn't match the technology of the advanced German airships. So with World War I looming, the British forces turned elsewhere for the air power they needed. They decided to try seaplanes, which offered the fleet an air wing that required minimal alteration to ships.
In 1914, the British have a cruiser with a few aircraft, and they also have a man, Murray Suter, who says, look, we can do a lot more. The Germans are not going to come out. They're an inferior navy. You have to have some way of destroying them in harbor. I'll do it. How? He'll take airplanes, he'll hang torpedoes from them, they'll find the German fleet, they'll go in, they'll kill it in harbor. Brilliant idea.
But Suter's first target was the Zeppelin sheds at Cuxhaven in northern Germany. He needed to get to the Zeppelins, but the seaplanes couldn't fly high enough to destroy them in the air, so instead they were targeted on the ground. 3 ferries were converted to haul the planes to the site, the first ever carrier task force.
The problem was that most of the seaplanes quite literally couldn't get off the water that day and had to be hoisted back on board. So the attack wasn't particularly successful, but it was a very early example of the attempt to use naval aviation and inspired the development of the aircraft carrier.
It's very obvious to the British that unless they can destroy Zeppelins, they'll never win. So they start putting fighters on their battleships.
Fighter planes were lighter and more agile than the heavier seaplanes. More importantly, they could reach the operating height of the Zeppelins.
If the ship steamed into the wind to give you lift from the wings, the existing lightweight biplanes could get airborne very quickly. The problem was that when you returned to the ship, it was simply impossible to land on. A little platform 100 feet long was not long enough. The early ships simply had to wait until the pilot ditched alongside and to fish the pilot out and as much of the plane as they could recover. This was wasteful and somewhat uneconomic and not very attractive for the pilots, who got rather wet. So the idea was that if you could land the plane on, you could then re-equip it and you could launch it again.
The necessity for a floating airfield for reconnaissance seaplanes had been realized for some years. This is HMS Furious, one of the Royal Navy's first carriers, a converted ship.
Originally a battleship, the HMS Furious had her huge forward guns removed and replaced by a takeoff deck and hangar. In charge of her air wing in August 1917 was Squadron Commander E.H. Dunning.
Dunning thought, this is a fast ship. If this can speed across Scapa Flow, the main fleet base, and I can probably hover over its forward deck because my stalling speed is equivalent to the speed of the ship. So if I put handles on the aeroplane, my squadron mates can pull me down onto the deck. And that's exactly what he did, and that was the world's first ever carrier landing in a ship underway. He tried it again the following day, and not surprisingly perhaps, killed himself.
Amazingly, by today's standards, the ship didn't have a seaboat, turned out, and it took 20 minutes for the ship to stop, turn around and pick him up again, by which time he'd drowned. He probably hit his head on the instrument panel as it went into the water. So he showed that his idea of landing on a ship was practical, but still too dangerous for everyday use.
As a result of Dunning's demise, HMS Furious was taken in for another conversion. This time, the after turret was removed and replaced with a landing deck. But the funnel and bridge remained in the middle of the ship, and the turbulence and smoke made landing extremely difficult.
The eventual answer was to clear the upper deck of all obstructions, and the first successful aircraft carrier, HMS Argus, actually was quite literally a flat-topped ship.
By 1918, a workable shape for the aircraft carrier had arrived. Air raids from the sea were now a more practical proposition.
The culmination of what was attempted at Cuxhaven comes at the end of the war with HMS Furious's raid on the Tondern sheds, which are now in Denmark. And Furious actually flew off planes from her forward deck with their bombs on board. They found the Zeppelin sheds at Tondern and destroyed them. It was a perfect example of what was attempted in 1914, but was now technically feasible in 1918.
World War I had been a crucible of innovation for the British Royal Navy Air Service. For a short time after the war, her carriers were world leaders, and their technology drew interest from navies around the world. One Royal Navy mission even went to Japan to aid in the development of a fleet air arm there. But the British superiority would not last long.
In 1917, American Navy aviators go over to the United Kingdom and they watch what's happening in the war. They come back after the war in 1919, having seen aircraft carriers in action, having participated in air operations, and they come back and they say, we've got to turn the United States Navy into an air-minded Navy.
Soon after, the U.S. Navy began experimenting with the new technology. An old coal ship named Jupiter was converted into the USS Langley, designated CV-1. U.S. pilots now had a ship on which to perfect the new art of carrier landing. The lightweight biplanes demanded extreme concentration, skill, and practice. Aboard the Langley, various landing systems were tested. And and the ideas of Glenn Curtiss were once again resurrected. Cables called arrestor wires were run across the flight deck. A hook on the incoming aircraft would catch one of the wires, bringing it to a halt. But an overtight cable would pull the plane's tails off, and too much slack would make it swerve to one side.
To stop that, there were wires that went across the deck from left to right, and then wires that went forward and back. And you see in early carrier aircraft, the ones used on Langley, for example, there's a hook in the back to catch the wires that go across the deck from left to right, and there are hooks under the wheels. There's an axle from one wheel to the next, and there are hooks underneath. They're there to catch the fore and aft wires to keep the airplane from going too far to the left or too far to the right.
Another innovation on the Langley was the Landing Signals Officer, or LSO.
There had to be some way to tell the pilot approaching the flight deck whether he was level as far as the flight deck was concerned. And the easiest way for someone to do that was to stand on the flight deck itself. And officers would stand there and at first use their arms to show the pilot whether the pilot was level with regard to the deck or whether the pilot was at the wrong angle approaching the deck. And very soon it becomes a set of paddles.
Away from the ships, politics was about to have a major impact on carrier development as well.
After World War I, there's a sense that the war came out of an arms race between Britain and Germany. So the United States calls a Naval Arms Limitation Conference at Washington in 1921. The result of that is to stop this nascent arms race. Everyone is limited in number of battleships. They're limited in carrier strength. They're not allowed to build new battleships for 10 years, and that's later extended to 15. The effect of that is to cut the number of battleships very drastically.
But the Washington Treaty did something else as well. It actually encouraged people to build aircraft carriers because people were allowed to use their old battleship and battlecruiser hulls and convert them into aircraft carriers. And four of the largest aircraft carriers of the interwar period, Japan's Akagi and Kaga, and the United States' Lexington and Saratoga, were converted capital ship hulls. It must be said that the majority opinion in the American Navy would rather they had been completed as battlecruisers.
Inadvertently, the treaty was instrumental in forging the aircraft carrier into an awesome offensive weapon. But first, the Navy had to overcome some inter-service politics. It had to beat out the Army, which wanted money spent on land-based air power. Army Colonel Billy Mitchell was set on proving that bombers, not ships, were the future of the military.
Today, history was made in Chesapeake Bay. Amid the crash of exploding bombs, obsolete battleships were sunk by airplanes for the first time. Veteran Army pilot General Billy Mitchell did what he said he would do. American battleships, which once sailed proudly round the world with the Great White Fleet, and only yesterday were defending America from her enemies, are at the bottom of the sea.
All this proved was that an old battleship with no crew on board, no anti-aircraft guns and not manoeuvring could be sunk by aircraft. And in the end, actually, Mitchell failed in his intention to form an independent American air service as we had in Britain.
But the threat to their air wing from Mitchell convinced Navy leaders to get serious about aviation. Aboard the Langley, air operations went into high gear under the orders of Captain Joseph M. Reeves.
And what Reeves discovered was that what a carrier needed to be able to do, to be an effective fighting unit, was to send off a lot of aircraft at once. And he was the one who changed operations on Langley and reduced the amount of time it took to get an airplane off and the amount of time it took to get an airplane back. And it was under his supervision and his prodding and the questions that he asked that Langley's flight deck crew was able to pioneer the method that was used so successfully in World War II to make American aircraft carriers very powerful striking units.
To be able to launch and recover aircraft quickly, Reeves introduced the deck park. A plane returning from a mission would be pushed forward to the front of the flight deck. A barrier would then be raised behind it. If the next aircraft coming in missed the wire, it would hit the barrier, not the airplane.
And so what would happen is that the planes would fill up the front end of the flight deck. Then the barrier would be lowered, the airplanes would be pushed back to the end of the flight deck, rearmed, refueled, and they were now ready for another takeoff and another strike. The other thing that Reeves understood was that Langley had to operate a lot of aircraft. So when he took command of the air forces in the Pacific, Langley was operating no more than 14 aircraft. And so under his leadership, Langley carried not just double the 14. There were times when Langley operated 42, triple that number. Yeah, a deck packed.
By the winter of 1925, the USS Langley was laying the foundation for the practical use of aircraft at sea. Operational patterns developed at that time are still in evidence today. On the noisy flight deck, colored jerseys are used to clearly identify individuals' roles. Brown jerseys are worn by plane captains. Red jerseys by those handling ordnance. Blue by plane handlers. Green by maintenance. And yellow by launch and recovery officers.
Almost as soon as we knew what a carrier was, they were playing with them in the game floor. And because you could try different technology before it really worked, they had a sense of what they could do. For example, they had a sense that large numbers of airplanes could make a difference. By 1929, we have two very large carriers, and we discovered they can successfully raid places. For example, we run an exercise that year in which they raid the Panama Canal.
In 1929, Fleet Problem 9 was the first fleet problem where you had the two big carriers, Lexington and Saratoga, exercising with the fleet. And there was a proposal by Admiral Reeves, who was in command of those ships, that they be used in attacks on land targets.
He took his carriers out to sea at the first day of the exercise and disappeared. His task was to attack the Panama Canal defences in support of his ground forces and so on. But he disappeared and nobody knew where he was. What he'd actually done was take his guys well out to sea, have a refreshing period of a few days, and then turn round, full steam ahead, head for the Panama Canal on the day when everybody else was winding down and the defenders were going to be having a few beers.
On this flight, we launched from 200 miles at sea. We caught the defenders on shore, completely unprepared, proceeded to our targets unattacked. Across the isthmus, the Pedro Miguel locks on the Pacific side. It's pretty bumpy air up there now. Here is the Gatun Dam, which we hope to torpedo and accomplish our purpose. It was a very successful, completely successful attack. When it was over, the order was issued to return to the carriers. In the meantime, the carriers had steamed at full speed back toward the target to recover their aircraft.
Afterward, there were people who said that this was a stroke of genius. If you go through the records, what you find is that there was a shortage of fuel in the force that Reeves was a part of. And it was actually the only way he could attack the canal effectively using the big carrier was to break it off from the battleships and the rest of the force. Nevertheless, it was a great success. It gave a lot of confidence to the Navy's aviators.
It was a couple of years before it dawned on the Americans that he'd actually hit upon the really specialist aspect of naval aviation, that you could turn up completely at surprise out of thousands of square miles of sea and deliver a telling blow with your airplanes.
The first such blow during wartime would come out of Mediterranean skies. On the night of November 11, 1940, from the decks of the British carrier HMS Illustrious, 21 swordfish of the Fleet Air Arm set off for Taranto Harbor, where Mussolini's fleet lay at anchor.
I was an observer in 815 Squadron, which was one of the swordfish squadrons in Illustrious. She carried 2, and we were in the Mediterranean running convoys, and the Italian fleet, which was at least twice as strong as us, blankly refused to come out and fight. So the decision was taken that if he wouldn't come out and fight, well, we would go in and fight, and the swordfish were sent in. It was a night attack, of course, because the one thing that we were scared stiff of in a swordfish was any enemy fighter in daylight. If we did any raid, the poor swordfish at 90 knots was sitting duck for any land-based fighter, and so we did everything at night. The first time we saw Taranto, we saw the gunfire first, because they hadn't got radar. Nobody had got radar in those days, but they had sound location, and they could pick us up at about 40 miles. We knew that. Although people talked about, oh yes, you got surprised, but we didn't, because 40 miles was 20 minutes, getting on for half an hour to get there in a swordfish, so they were well prepared.
The swordfish swarmed across Taranto harbor at low level to drop their torpedoes. They had to fly below 100 feet and below 100 knots, so that the torpedoes would not break up on impact with the water. They braved a ceaseless barrage of anti-aircraft fire.
I think we got away with it simply because most of this stuff was going over the top of us. And you could hear it, and you could smell it, and you could see it, and it was like a ring of people shooting rockets at you all the time, I suppose. We were slightly disappointed when we came back to the ship because we didn't see the great big fountain of water that you would expect from a torpedo hitting the side of a ship. And it wasn't until the next day that the RAF went over and photographed the results, that they came back and showed us the photographs, and we all rather cheered up then and thought it was worth a libation, you know.
It was a resounding success. The British raid had disabled 3 battleships, a cruiser, and 2 destroyers. Half of the Italian fleet with the loss of only 2 swordfish. On the other side of the world, the Japanese took notice.
The Japanese took a very great interest in what had happened at Taranto in November 1940. They didn't know if torpedoes could run effectively in harbour if they were dropped by aircraft in relatively shallow water. Taranto showed what could be done in harbour with a torpedo-carrying aircraft, and it certainly helped catalyse the idea that a major attack against an enemy fleet in harbour was a practical proposition.
The success of the Taranto attack may very well have convinced them that they could do a Pearl Harbor assault. The more interesting issue about Taranto is once you saw this happen, how come you wouldn't expect it to happen at our big fleet base? And part of it was a belief that it was too shallow for torpedoes, but Taranto's pretty shallow too. In fact, the British lost torpedoes in the mud. So it might be more, why didn't we get the message, rather than did the Japanese get inspired?
On December 7th, 1941, a year after the British carrier raid on Taranto, the Japanese Imperial Fleet showed the rest of the world the devastating firepower of the carrier's strike force. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 6 carriers caught the U.S. Pacific Fleet totally unprepared. Pearl Harbor would be a milestone in the evolution of carrier warfare. The Japanese called it X-Day, and it marked the beginning of the end of the battleship era.
Pearl Harbor had destroyed the American battle fleet as a traditional fleet of battleships. All the Americans had left were their aircraft carriers. This meant that if they were going to strike back at any further Japanese thrust, they had to do it with their aircraft carriers. And this led the way into the first battles in which ships fight each other out of sight, using the aircraft as their primary striking system.
If you think of what carriers do, the leverage is mobility. You can show up anywhere. Jeez. All of a sudden, they showed up with Pearl Harbor. Okay. We didn't know they were coming. We show up with Tokyo. Ouch.
The United States aircraft carrier Hornet, part of a task force steaming into Japanese waters, is now revealed as the secret base from which American planes first bombed Tokyo.
The Americans had mounted from their Navy aircraft carriers U.S. Army Air Force aircraft. These aircraft were led by a famous American pilot, Jimmy Doolittle, and hence it is known as the Doolittle Raid, but in fact it did a great deal.
The raid began on April 18, 1942, 700 miles from the coast of Japan. This was beyond the range of the Navy's bombers, so Army B-25s were brought on board for the strike. The mission clearly proved a carrier could project power far beyond its horizon. And although the bombing was of little tactical value, its emotional impact was huge. It was the first bombing of the Japanese mainland.
This was a tremendous shock to the Japanese, a tremendous cultural shock. They were so angry they cut the heads off the pilots, the ones they captured. And this led the Japanese into thinking the US carrier fleet is our major threat. This meant that they would have to go after the American fleet, and this tipped the balance into a major operation against the islands of Midway, not so much to capture the islands themselves, but to draw out the remnants of the American fleet, the carriers in particular, and sink them. And it all went dreadfully wrong.
Midway lies directly between Japan and Hawaii. Admiral Yamamoto planned to invade Midway, knowing that his adversary, Admiral Chester Nimitz, would be unable to tolerate a Japanese base so uncomfortably close to Pearl Harbor. Nimitz would have to rush his carriers to Midway. And there, Yamamoto would annihilate them.
Unless they kill the U.S. carriers, they can't be free. So the U.S. knows this, but we're interested in killing their carriers, because if we do that, we can operate much more freely. So we find out in advance where the Japanese are going to attack. We do that by code breaking, and we're ready for them.
The Americans had sent extra aircraft to Midway in preparation for the impending Japanese invasion. Just after sunrise on June 4, 1942, Marine pilots took off. The battle was about to begin, and its outcome would alter the course of the war in the Pacific. Carrier helmsman Floyd Moss recalls the encounter.
We picked up a communication of the Japanese that they were going to capture Midway and use it for a base. And Nimitz had broken the Japanese code at that time and understood they were coming in, and they were going to come in, sneak in from the north and hit Midway. But we caught their planes on deck, fueled with bombs on them.
A sea-level attack by U.S. torpedo planes drew the Japanese Zero fighters down from their patrol high above the carriers. The Zeros slaughtered the two torpedo squadrons, but the pilots did not go down in vain. High above, two squadrons of dive bombers from the USS Yorktown and two from the USS Enterprise advanced upon the enemy, unnoticed by the distracted Zeros. Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable, their decks packed with refueling aircraft and munitions. At 10:22 a.m., the dive bombers arrived. 6 minutes later, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were wrapped in flames and erupting with repeated explosions. The final toll was 4 Japanese carriers lost to 1 American. Midway was Japan's first defeat at sea in 350 years. It was the turning point of the war.
Once the battle began, carriers were vulnerable. They didn't have armored flight decks. in the Japanese Navy or the United States Navy. They were full of aviation gas, high-octane aviation gas, which is very volatile. They carried a lot of ammunition, bombs, and torpedoes for the strike aircraft that they had. And so they were floating volcanoes, and it was understood that the carrier that could get in the first strike, or the carrier force that could attack the other first, would probably destroy the other. And in fact, it might be possible for one force to completely eliminate the other at the opening stage of a battle.
Midway proved that first strike was vital in carrier-based warfare. And the Allies were about to gain a further advantage from a new technology called radar.
The radio waves pass through clouds or darkness, and by their echoes can locate airplanes hidden from sight.
Radar is still a key advance warning system for modern navies, giving the fleets an instant picture of approaching aircraft and ships. The technology came into its own in the latter years of the Pacific War.
If you go 2 years after Midway, there's a battle called the Philippine Sea. At this time, the Japanese have very painfully rebuilt their carrier force. We have a much larger carrier force ourselves, thanks to our production in the United States. The Japanese still have very long-range aircraft, longer range than ours, incidentally. They find us first. By pre-war rules, if you find the other fellow first, it's over. He can't defend himself very well. His carriers get blown up. That's what happened at Midway. But by this time, we know how to use radar. So as their attack comes across, we kill it. In fact, it's such a disaster, we call it the turkey shoot. The turkey's not being very good at avoiding being shot. We don't sink most of the carriers. We destroy the aircraft in the air. That's a triumph of radar and very good fighter control.
The Japanese nemesis during the June 19, 1944 turkey shoot was Lieutenant Alexander Verashu, a Hellcat pilot. By shooting down 6 Japanese planes in a single sortie, he became an ace in just one day.
On the 19th, we had 12 planes on deck, wings spread, and when the radars start noticing big groups of planes coming in, then they launch us. We climbed up, and I spotted 3 specks coming in our direction, but the sound of the fighter director's voice was a little more serious than just 3, the way I figured. And I kept looking, and sure enough, there was a whole mob, a rambling mass of planes coming in our direction, about 2,000 feet below. He had put us in the perfect position, 2,000 feet above them, off to the side just a little bit. And so we got over to them, and then we just started peel on down. It was just narrowing down to go after my first plane on the edge. Got him burning pretty fast, and pulled back up again, and then started down again. And it was just a matter of going back and forth. And on my second run, I got on one of them, burned him, dipped my wing over and slid over to another plane alongside of him and burned him down too. I always remember, I think I had a little lapse in feeling there, because all of a sudden I could see that tail gunner on that Judy, that aircraft, as the plane was going down in a deep spiral. He was still peppering away at me with his 7.7 on the thing, and for just a split second I kind of felt sorry for him.
The shift of power at sea from the once mighty dreadnoughts to the revolutionary aircraft carriers had one final brutal chapter. Yamato, the world's biggest battleship and the pride of the Japanese fleet, was sent to her watery grave on the afternoon of April 7th, 1945, bludgeoned by the aircraft from 2 American carriers. 4 months later, the war was over.
When World War II ends, the great new facts of life are jet aircraft and the bomb. And the question is, carriers that are very effective with much slower airplanes that carry relatively small bombs, can they still be effective in future? And there's a lot of interest in what it will take to make a carrier effective with these new things.
From the aircraft carrier Illustrious, at exercise in the Atlantic, come first pictures of the Navy's own jet fighter, the Vickers Supermarine Attacker, a descendant of the Spitfire.
Once again, the British led the way, solving the handling problems of the fast, heavy jets.
British aircraft carriers have always tended to be a little bit on the small side in comparison with the aircraft operating from them. This was particularly true after the Second World War, when we couldn't afford to build new aircraft carriers, but aircraft were getting larger and much faster, in particular with the advent of jets. Therefore, the British take the lead in the development of carrier operational equipment.
Using dummy bundles at first, HMS Perseus tests the Navy's new steam-operated catapult. With the new system, planes can be launched from a stationary ship. Here goes a radio-controlled pilotless plane. Sunk below deck, the catapult doesn't interfere with ordinary flying on and off. Now with pilot in control, the catapult will cope with large planes too. Results are so good that we're now going to teach the Americans how to do it. It proves once again that the old firm can still think up new wrinkles.
The catapults of the past are hydraulic. They operate with a hydraulic ram and a lot of pulleys. It turns out that the power you can get that way is limited. The ropes break, they're wire ropes. But if you have steam, you just have a piston and it goes wham. You can get enormous power. Now, that power is equivalent to giving the airplane a very long runway to take off. So instead of airplanes that weigh, say, 20,000 pounds, we talk about 60, 70,000 pound airplanes. Suddenly, there's a new world.
A new world that uses steam, the power source of the Industrial Revolution. Today, steam continues to power the catapults on board the Nimitz-class carriers.
Here we go. The physical difference of the two catapults was a hydraulic catapult, you get the full wham right at first, and then it diminishes as you go down the deck. The steam catapult, you pick it up all going down the deck. It has various orifices that keep putting more and more steam to you as you go down the deck.
But landing the fast jets was a hazardous operation. The faster approach gave the pilot less time to respond to the landing signals officer. Even the wire barrier could not prevent all crashes.
In the late 40s and early 50s, the casualty rate amongst fleet aircrew was terrible. I joined the Gloria in Malta. She'd been out there just 2 years. She'd arrived with 38 aircrew, and they were holding the 38th funeral the day I joined, after 2 years. Something had to be done about it. A lot of the accidents were on landing, and a brilliant Royal Navy engineer called Nick Goodhart devised a scheme so that it was all done by mirrors.
I was working in the Ministry of Aviation, in fact, for a captain called Dennis Campbell. I went to him and said, I'm going to set up a little demonstration. And so we got his secretary and asked her if she had a mirror in her handbag, and of course she had the inevitable nice little rectangular mirror in her handbag. And if she had any lipstick, of course she did. So we said, right, put the mirror on the deck of the model carrier and draw a lipstick line across the middle of it. And then we got a torch, a flashlight in American, and put it on the stern of the carrier, pointing towards the mirror. And we said to Miss Montgomery, the secretary, go back to the far side of the room and move your head up and down until you see the reflection of the flashlight in the middle of the mirror. When you've got it in the middle of the mirror, walk forward slowly, keeping the reflection on the lipstick line, which she duly did. And she walked across the room, getting lower and lower and lower and lower. And eventually her chin came to rest on the round down of the model. So he was duly impressed, as Captain Campbell. He thought really that did have something in it. If a secretary not trained in deck landing can make a perfect deck landing first shot, it looks good.
It's a device which aids high-speed landings, particularly by jet fighters. The pilot watches a row of lights on the carrier as he comes into land. By lining them up with another blob of light reflected in a mirror, he can make a faultless touchdown.
And it was simply a convex mirror with a light shining into it, reflecting up into the 3.5 degrees into the glide slope. You could visualize a light of ray back behind the ship, and you were trying to fly down that ray. And the image was such that if you got above the glide slope, this little image in the center of it would go higher than the reference marks. And if you got below, obviously, it would go below the same indications.
Today, the mirrors have been replaced by Fresnel projector lamps. The center light, or meatball, moves above or below a row of green datum lights. Another change was devised by Captain Dennis Campbell himself as a means of eliminating the need for a barrier.
With carriers, we put up a safety barrier to keep the airplane from crashing into the planes that are already sitting on the deck forward. Well, the barrier is typically a wire, and the idea is that if you're landing with a propeller plane, the wire wraps around the propeller. Well, if there's no propeller, the wire comes right back into the cockpit and decapitates the pilot, which tends to be unpopular with pilots.
Campbell's innovation was an angled flight deck.
With the angled deck, we could come aboard with a given power setting. If you missed a wire, add power and go on around. It came along at the time of the jets, which was great for them in that you just left 80% power on, you pick up the wire, swell. You miss the wire, go around again.
We introduced both the angled deck and the mirror at once, and it's not absolutely clear from the statistics, but certainly of at least for every 5 accidents we used to have, we now only had 1.
In 1960, the U.S. Navy added nuclear power to the other carrier innovations. The USS Enterprise was the first to be designated CVN. The N stood for nuclear. The fast, angled deck carriers had become the behemoth warships of the oceans, capable of launching almost 100 supersonic aircraft into any danger zone.
All of a sudden, you have a modern carrier. And you can see in carriers built in the 1950s very much what you see now. So people say, well, gee, nothing else has happened. But that's because the carrier's open. What's happened is different aircraft.
In today's complex world, the nuclear-powered carriers have become the ultimate military weapon, responsible for both projecting power and using it. These Leviathans can circle the globe and continue to launch a succession of ever more modern aircraft from their decks.
If you ask me, I think the next generation is it's going to have all the capabilities that you see here. It's just not going to have me flying in it. The days of unmanned vehicles are already here, and mainly they're used for reconnaissance and things like that, but they're already developed combat versions. And if you ask me right now, the limiting factor in this type of machine, this weapons platform, is the pilot.
For over 5 decades, the Commander-in-Chief's first response to a world crisis has been, where are the carriers? In fact, within hours of the September 2001 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, President Bush ordered the carrier George Washington to deploy to New York Harbor. It was there to protect, patrol, assist, and reassure. But primarily, it was there as a show of power for both friends and foes. It said, better than any other show of military might could, we are strong, we are aware, and we are here.
What happens in the future? Well, the missiles obviously get more important. On the other hand, a lot of the time, you're not interested in actually blowing somebody up. A lot of the time, the interest is in dissuading some foreign government from some evil course of action, convincing friends that will back them. Well, You don't do that by killing people. You do that by showing up so they know you could if you wanted to. That means it has to be something they can see that doesn't have to be used up each time it's there. A carrier still is the easiest way to have airplanes someplace. In a world that's very unsettled, being able to demonstrate power makes a tremendous difference. The carrier is probably the best way to do that.
In 1805, when the British Admiral Horatio Nelson crushed the combined navies of France and Spain at the Battle of Trafalgar, he led a fleet of wooden-walled battleships that in their day were at the forefront of technology. His ship's cannons had a firing range of 500 yards. Today's missiles can engage the enemy at a range of 5,000 miles. The story of war at sea has always been intertwined with the progress of technology. And as new advances are made, the quest for command of the seas will continue, for as long as nations choose the warship as their greatest projection of power.
Warship sails on at PBS Online. Come aboard and learn more about the history of naval technology at pbs.org.
Track 8304, range 16 nautical miles, over. Down scopes.
Warship was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. Additional funding is provided by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.